know we're an older group. Probably made it that long ago. If you look at the monuments around, you'll see that most of them are DAR. But we do, our big thing that we're doing now is trying to identify every patriot grave in South Carolina.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you all for staying this late. I want to tell a 21st century South Carolina story before I go back to the 18th century. My good friend Luther Wanamaker of St. Matthew's has breakfast every morning with a group of his friends, and on Wednesday morning in a restaurant, and on Wednesday morning he took me along. And in the course of breakfast, a man sitting right across the table from me said, Jack, where do you live? And I said, New York City. And he said, I'm so sorry. But I roll with the punches. But now back to the 18th century. I have not the honor of your acquaintance, but am no stranger to your character and memory. The writer, of course, Major General Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island, the newly arrived commander of the Southern Department. The recipient, our own Francis Marion, the South Carolina militia commander. Greene also wrote something that was quite characteristic of him. I like your plan of frequently shifting your ground. It frequently prevents a surprise and perhaps the total loss of your party. Really? As if Marion needed reminding of that. Now, despite his praise of Marion during that long retreat through North Carolina with Lord Cornwallis in pursuit, Greene exploded when he found almost 1,700 militia muskets, quote, in the most miserable order you can imagine, and these are some of the happy effects of defending the country with militia, from which the good Lord deliver us. Now, this statement of Greene's was not an unusual outburst. He'd been expressing similar sentiments since early in the war. He was livid in 1776, following the American debacles on Long Island and at Kips Bay of Manhattan Island. Now, Greene wasn't present at the first disaster. He'd been Washington's choice to lead the defense of Long Island, but he'd been laid low by malaria and in fact almost died. He recovered and was on Manhattan, but not nearby when Connecticut militia stampeded from bayonet-wielding British and German troops at Kips Bay and beyond, in Washington's words, with the utmost precipitation. 2 weeks later, Greene wrote to his brother Jacob, the policy of Congress has been the most absurd and ridiculous imaginable, pouring in militiamen who come and go every month. A military force established upon such principles defeats itself. People coming from home with all the tender feelings of domestic life are not sufficiently fortified with natural courage to stand the shocking scenes of war, to march over dead men, to hear without concern the groans of the wounded. I say few men can stand such scenes unless steeled by habit or fortified by military pride. Now, Greene, of course, was referring to the use of militia in formal set-piece battle. Following the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Greene continued his barrage of criticism of militia in a letter to Samuel Huntington, President of the Continental Congress. The militia, in our interest, can do little more than keep the Tories in subjugation. Well, our answer to that is keeping the Tories in subjugation was one of the most important missions of rebel militia. Greene continued, these states were in better condition to make exertions last campaign than this. All right, there was a good measure of truth to that statement, but then he wrote, quote, the well-effected last year, that is 1780, spent their time and substance in fruitless exertions. Now that was not true, and Greene must have known it. We all know, in 1780, during the first phase of the Rising, Sumter, Marion, Clark, Shelby, and other less well-known but gifted leaders of the rebel militia, without the help of regular forces, saved the revolution in the Carolinas. Now, Greene's views were widely known and not well taken by many, North and South. Let me quote from a letter to Greene from his good friend, Joseph Reed, president of the Pennsylvania Council, writing from Philadelphia, 16 June, 1781, after the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill. Reed offered Greene some sage advice. People here curb. They insist that you hold the militia in contempt and are too much inclined to attribute failures to them. Indeed, the manner in which your dispatches after the Battle of Guilford describe the failure compared with that of the affair before Camden, when the Maryland Continentals failed you, has added some force to the remark. Now, my sentiments of militia have been ever pretty much the same, but I see plainly that the great body of people of America will never allow them to support a permanent force equal to the defense of the country. So we must give up the contest or cherish the militia. The successes which they have obtained to the northward, at Kings Mountain and elsewhere, seem also to give them some meritorious claim. Depend upon it, the bulk of the country resent any indignity towards the militia. In short, at this time of day, we must say of them as prior of a wife, be to their faults a little blind, and to their virtues very kind. Greene answered on 6 August, I am far from despising the militia. I have ever considered them the great palladium of American liberty. Well, I have yet to find any evidence of that in any of his correspondence. I'm looking, but I haven't found it yet. Now, he added, it was my duty to state the force of the militia of this country in its proper light. And he had done in his letter to Samuel Huntington. And after the criticisms in that letter, which I quoted earlier, he observed that the conflict may continue for some time longer, and General Sumter and Marion deserve great credit for their exertions and perseverance. But their endeavors rather serve to keep the contest alive than lay a foundation for the recovery of the states. And in 1780, of course, Marion and Sumter and others had kept the contest alive. But what Greene meant by laying a foundation for the recovery of the states was a general plan of operation in which the militia and Greene's regular army cooperated and fought in combination with each other. Because hit-and-run guerrilla raids, as vital as they were not going to win the campaign, were not going to liberate South Carolina and Georgia. Now, in 1780, there had been a small window of opportunity for combined operations when Horatio Gates and his Continentals entered South Carolina. Marion wanted to work with the Continentals. He rode into North Carolina to meet that army at its bivouac on Deep River, when it was still commanded by the Baron de Kalb. And that is an initial key, I believe, to understanding Francis Marion and what made him different from Thomas Sumter. I agree with Marion's biographer, Hugh Rankin, that Marion did not want to operate in a vacuum. He wanted to operate in a larger operation. He would, and he could, and he did operate by himself after Gates's army was thoroughly thrashed at Camden, where, with one exception, the Virginia and North Carolina militia regiments challenged the Connecticut militia at Kips Bay as to who could run faster. But Marion still wanted to be part of that larger operation, thus his ride north to meet the Continentals, and when Gates took over, Marion returned to meet the new commander. Gates was not impressed. His adjutant, Otho Holland Williams, recorded the general was glad of an opportunity of detaching Colonel Marion towards the interior of South Carolina, with orders to watch the motions of the enemy and furnish intelligence. After his return to South Carolina, Marion wrote to Gates describing his activities, but Gates neglected him, rarely answered his letters, didn't use him as Nathaniel Greene would. In late November 1780, not long before Greene succeeded to the command of the Southern Department, Marion wrote to Gates, Many of the people has left me and gone over to the enemy, for they think we have no army coming on and have been deceived. As we hear nothing from you, I hope to have a line from you in what manner to act and some assurance to the people of support. That letter is further evidence of Marion's deep desire to be part of a larger operation, coming right out and asking Gates in what manner to act. Gates' silence, of course, is neither strange nor unexpected, just as Gates hadn't a clue how to use militia in concert with regulars in set-piece battle. He really didn't understand how to use them in a partisan campaign. Now, when Nathaniel Greene praised Marion's character and merit was certainly part of Marion's makeup, but when Greene wrote that, he was obviously buttering up a key militia commander. But there were more to his words than that. Nathaniel Greene was above all a realist. The apparent contradiction between praising a militia officer and heatedly criticizing the policy of depending on militia for the war effort is readily explained in another sentence in the same letter to Marion. Quote, "Until a more permanent army can be collected than is in the field at present, we must endeavor to keep up a partisan war to preserve the tide of sentiment among the people as much as possible in our favor." But Joseph Reed was right. That permanent army would never be collected. And if I might add parenthetically, except in wartime, the American people resisted a large standing military until the advent of the Cold War in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Thus we have a grafting here between a Rhode Islander and a South Carolinian that bore splendid fruit. Consider Marion's first letter to Greene, written 3 days before Christmas, 1780. He makes no promises, he stresses the difficulties, but, quote, "shall endeavor to procure intelligence and as you desire." And of great interest is his statement that if I had a few continental troops, I should be able to do much more than I am at present by our army, the militia, who act with diffidence. 100 would be sufficient for this purpose. His second letter to Greene, written 2 days after that Christmas of 1780, is equally interesting. Marion states without equivocation, quote, "I shall observe your orders and let you know every movement of the enemy." Those two letters alone immediately marked the operational difference between Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter. Sumter remained aloof, acting independently, obstructing Greene's efforts. Sorry about that, David. I had to get it in. Marion, on the other hand, accepted Greene's embrace, acknowledging him as the senior partner in the glorious cause. But on 4 January 1781 comes the first mention of a subject that eventually threatened to destroy the relationship. Greene sent Marion an order to send horses soon. Marion replied that he had only enough horses for his own men, but he will send Greene a few more that may be got, whereupon Greene comes back, hoping that Marion, quote, "paid particular attention of the order sent you by Governor Rutledge for collecting the horses, what number you have, what addition you can expect." And Greene wanted those horses for his own Continental cavalry. Now, leaving the horses aside for a while, in a letter to Greene of mid-January 1781, Marion touched upon a subject that bedeviled not only him, but all commanders of militia throughout the country. Referring to 150 Tories under Hector McNeil at Drown Creek, near the North Carolina line, he described them as dangerous because they can collect a large number of Tories from North Carolina, and if Marion marches against McNeil, he would be forced to leave 50 miles open to the enemy, which would leave his men's families and properties exposed, and his troops would desert, in his words, almost to a man. In his next letter, 20 January, Marion wrote on a subject dear to his heart. Now, Marion was not a prima donna, but he was ever watchful of his prerogatives. He informed Greene that if Light Horse Harry Lee joined him, which Lee did, Marion expected to command. Not because Governor Rutledge had recently promoted him to Brigadier General of Militia of all militia regiments east of the Santee, Wateree, and Catawba rivers, because of, quote, an elder Continental Commission, which he brought to Greene's attention, as it may not in any juncture be disputed. In other words, Marion's Continental Commission was senior to Lee's, therefore he would command. Greene's reply to that 5 days later was ambiguous. He wished Marion, quote, to advise him, that is Lee, upon all occasions, advise with him on all occasions. You may place the highest confidence in him with perfect security, and I persuade myself there will be no disputes between you respecting rank. On the same day, Lee sent his official report to Greene on the assault on Georgetown by his Legion Infantry and Marion's militia. He wrote, I, get that, I instead of we. I completely surprised the garrison of Georgetown, and he blamed the failure to carry the town on the blunders of the guides. He then reports that I am on another expedition. Tomorrow will determine it. Lee also wrote a second letter to Greene that day describing in more detail the assault on Georgetown, and a reader coming cold to those letters with no background on events preceding it would have no idea it was a joint expedition. Marion and his men were also involved, and that other expedition that I will undertake, Marion explained it in a letter to Greene written 2 days later. They were going to attack the British post at Wright's Bluff, also known as Fort Watson, on the Santee River. And he added this sentence, Colonel Lee's enterprising genius promises much. And we don't know why Lee failed to mention Marion and his men with regard to the Georgetown affair, unless we can chalk it up to Lee's not inconsiderable ego. Charles Royster, who wrote that wonderful book on Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee and the Legacy of the American Revolution, wrote an introduction to the 1998 Da Capo Press edition of Lee's memoirs. Chris Swagger was kind enough to bring to my attention Royster's, in her words, delicious summing up of Lee. Royster wrote, quote, he expected to be obeyed by soldiers and honored by citizens because he was braver, smarter, and better than they were. I love that quote. Marion, on the other hand, had gone out of his way to praise Lee. Because of Lee's temperament, there is the temptation to assume tension in the relationship, but it wasn't the case, at least not serious tension. The two men operated very well in tandem during that short period before Greene recalled Lee for the long retreat through North Carolina, and they cooperated during the longer period after Greene and the Army returned to South Carolina, and Lee once again joined Marion. I've always found the Marion-Lee team quite remarkable. Both men were prickly. Marion was subject to fits of depression, that condition Winston Churchill called, referring to himself, a black dog. Marion was not a glory hound. Lee, however, definitely hankered after the glory. Yet it was one of the most successful, perhaps the most successful melding of regulars and militia during the war. Now, during his retreat through North Carolina, Greene did not make Gates's mistake. He stayed in touch with Marion, writing from Guilford Courthouse in February during the retreat, but conveying news that Marion would not have welcomed. Greene had asked Sumter to call out the militia of South Carolina and employ them in destroying the enemy's stores and perplexing their affairs, and that Marion should, quote, communicate in concert with Sumter until it is possible for Marion to have free intercourse with Greene. Now, the last thing Marion wanted to do was to communicate in concert with Sumter. And he was right to be wary. At the time Greene wrote, Sumter was engaged in his mishandled, ill-fated foray against British river posts, and later that year, Marion and his men would suffer through the shambles of Sumter's Dog Days expedition. Greene wrote again from Halifax Courthouse, Virginia, explaining why he had crossed the Dan River into Virginia and hopes he will soon be able to push poor Lord Cornwallis in turn. After the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Greene wrote from Deep River in North Carolina, sent by Captain James Conyers to explain Greene's plans and give Marion a full history of the Army's operations, including the battle. Conyers was also to seek Marion's assistance in securing provisions, and Marion would cooperate fully in this regard. And regarding provisions, Marion sent 100 head of cattle and reported that Greene would receive 100 more and 60 hogs. In that same letter, he once more revealed his subordination to Greene. Marion wanted to cross the Santee and give the inhabitants on that side a chance to join him, quote, if it would not interfere with Greene's plans. Lee rejoined Marion on 14 April, and the following day they began the siege of Fort Watson, where Lee kept urging Greene to send artillery. In a letter of 20 April, while the siege continued, Lee wrote that Marion's troops had less than 2 rounds per man, and he asked Greene to write a long letter to Marion, who was feeling, and this is Lee's word, neglected. Now we can speculate that if Marion was indeed once more suffering from the black dog, it was because of his lack of ammunition, men leaving camp and going home, and concern that he and Lee would be unable to take Fort Watson. This was before Hezekiah Mahan came up with the idea for his famous tower. In any event, on 24 April, one day before the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, Greene wrote one of his patented letters of praise to Marion. Let me quote the opening and ending sentences of the pertinent paragraph. When I consider how much you have done and suffered, and under what disadvantages you have maintained your ground, I am at a loss at which to admire most, your courage and fortitude, or your address and management. Nothing will give me greater pleasure than to do justice to your merit, and I shall miss no opportunity of disclosing to Congress, the Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, and the world in general, the great sense I have of your merit and services. When Fort Watson fell, Greene congratulated Marion and his men, as well as the articles of capitulation, and referred to the fort surrendering to Marion. The next day, however, the subject of horses rose again. Greene writing, get all the good dragoon horses you can to mount our cavalry. This is a great object, and I beg you pay particular attention to it. And on the 2nd of May, Light Horse Harry Lee had, without Marion's knowledge, waded into the fractious subject of horses, informing Greene that Marion can supply, if he will, 150 dragoon horses from his militia, most of them impressed, and he can spare 60 horses, which would be a happy supply. Greene's reaction in a letter to Marion 2 days later almost led to a rupture. Greene reminded Marion that he had written several times of his desperate need of horses, begged for an early answer, then wrote the highly offending words. I am told the militia claim all they take from the Tories, and many of the best horses are collected from the inhabitants on this principle. I cannot think the practice warranted either in justice or policy. If the object of the people is to plunder altogether, government can receive little benefit from them. The horses would be of the highest importance to the public in the regular service. Now, every now and then, Greene, who was a fine letter writer, wrote one better left unwritten. He had written one to Sumter shortly after taking command, in which he implied that Sumter was interested only in plunder, which infuriated the Gamecock. With regard to Marion, one might ask, if regulars could impress horses from Tories or any citizen, why couldn't militia do the same? They were fighting and dying too. Needed horses as much as Greene's regular cavalry. Indeed, horses were the secret of their success, and this was testified to by British soldiers. Horses gave them their priceless mobility. It is further evidence, I think, of Greene's basic distaste for militia, despite knowing that he needed them. Marion, of course, was highly offended, and on 6 May he wrote his famous letter claiming that it had never been in my power to furnish horses. The few taken from Tories had been kept for service, never for private property. Well, that may have been fudging a little. But if you think it best for the service to dismount the militia now with me, I will direct Colonel Lee and Captain Conyers to do so. But I'm certain we shall never get their service in the future. As for Marion himself, he had been determined to relinquish my command of the militia as soon as you arrived. Now at the time, Marion and Lee were about to besiege Fort Mott. Marion committed to see that out, but then wishes to, quote, wait on you when I hope to get permission to go to Philadelphia. Well, Greene hastened to repair the damage, first by letter. It is not my wish to take horses from the militia if it will injure the public service. The effects and consequences you can better judge than I can. As for Marion resigning and going to Philadelphia, I will add nothing more on this subject until I see you in person. And this was obviously a matter that needed a face-to-face. Shortly after the fall of Fort Mott, Greene rode there, and for the first time, he and Marion met, talked, and the air was cleared. There would be a few bumps along the way. Greene requested Marion to take part in the recruitment scheme known as Sumter's Law. Marion refused. On 18 May, Marion received 2 letters from 2 of Greene's aides instructing him to receive Sumter's orders until Greene ordered otherwise, and to arrange his militia with expedition and be ready to cooperate with Greene's Continentals. Marion did not join Sumter. He had asked Greene for permission to attack Georgetown and awaited orders. Greene answered that he had no objection, provided Lord Rawdon is not making preparations for offensive operations or expose General Sumter in his present position. Greene also considered Georgetown an inferior object. When Marion marched on Georgetown before receiving Greene's instructions, took it, announced its capture to Greene, and wrote, "It cannot be conceived the joy this event has given our friends." Greene accepted the fait accompli and replied that he took great pleasure in the capture and shared Marion's view that it will be attended with many good consequences to that part of the country. But Greene was most unhappy with all 3 of the big 3 of the partisan leaders, Marion, Sumter, and Pickens, for their failure to join him during Lord Rawdon's march up country to the relief of 96. He wrote to Marion that he had been obliged to raise the siege and that his plan had been to fight Rawdon before Rawdon reached 96. And could I have collected your force and those of General Sumter and Pickens, I would have done it. But being left alone, I was obliged to retire. Then Greene went into his lecture mode again, which he did on occasion. I am surprised the people should be so averse to joining in some general plan of operation. It will be impossible to carry on the war to advantage, or even attempt to hold the country, unless our force can be directed to a point. And as to flying parties here and there, they are of no consequence in the great event of the war. If the people will not be more united in their views, they must abide the consequences. For I will not calculate upon them at all, unless they will agree to act conformable to the great plan of recovering all parts of the country, and all but not particular parts. Now, if Marion took offense to this, the correspondence doesn't reveal it. Perhaps he agreed with Greene, who was certainly right, that the campaign had long reached a point where a general plan of operation was necessary. In any event, there's no indication of disagreement between the 2 from then until the British evacuation of Charleston. In fact, the opposite. Their correspondence reveals 2 men working closely together to reach a common goal. Greene did come back on one occasion to a subject he had broached in his first letter to Marion. Quote, "Whatever position you take with your troops, it will be necessary frequently to change it, which will keep the enemy in the dark and prevent their enterprising anything against you." Really, Nathaniel? Hadn't you realized by then that such maneuvers were Marion's stock in trade? Now, Marion could fight conventionally. He proved himself in set-piece battle at Eutaw Springs. Yet he was also the classic guerrilla leader, waging brilliantly, alone and in concert with Lee, the partisan war that Greene adopted early in the campaign. Francis Marion's greatest contribution to the cause was his willingness to subordinate himself to Nathaniel Greene, to report to Greene, follow Greene's orders, and cooperate instead of waging an independent campaign. Now, finally, I'd like to close on a lighter note. An exchange of letters late in 1781 between Greene and Marion on a very serious matter to both men. But given their history, I find this exchange amusing. Greene informed Marion that in his opinion, the units commanded by Peter Uri and Hezekiah Mahan should be legionary, half infantry and the other half cavalry. For given the fall of Lord Cornwallis, the nature of the war has changed so as to render infantry much more useful than horse, which are 5 times as expensive. And therefore, he saw no need of having a very great body of cavalry in the field. Greene's final sentence, I beg your opinion on the matter. Marion replied the next day. He agreed that Uri and Mahan's units should also have infantry. And he finished the letter, we already have more cavalry than necessary. Should it hereafter be necessary to have more, the militia horse will answer the purpose just as well. Thank you. Any questions, sir?
Jack,
Yes.
was not the Southern militia better in quality than the Northern militia?
There was one big difference. They were mounted, which gave them that mobility that they really needed to operate against the British. There wasn't much country in the north that was good for mounted cavalry, and they weren't accustomed. The militia in the north wasn't accustomed to riding. But if you look at the Battle of Bennington, which came before the Battle of Saratoga, in which the New England and New York militia overran and destroyed a Hessian regiment and stopped a second Hessian regiment from coming to the relief of their comrades. Or the Battle of Oriskany, which was also during the Saratoga campaign in the Mohawk Valley of New York State, in which Mohawk Valley, New York State militia was ambushed by Iroquois Indians and Tory Rangers who had come down from Canada. Took to the woods. They definitely were ambushed. They were surprised. They took heavy casualties. They took to the woods, fought back, inflicted heavy casualties themselves, and they were marching to the relief of Fort Stanwix. They were stopped. It was sort of a draw. They were stopped and had to retreat after the battle was over. But they inflicted such heavy casualties on the Indians that when the Indians got back to Fort Stanwix, they raided the British camp and took off. They were so disgusted with the casualties they'd taken at the Battle of Oriskany. There was vicious militia, guerrilla fighting with militia in New Jersey, the New Jersey campaign early in the war. So, I'd say no. Okay? We can argue about that. Yes, sir.
The cooperation between Marion and Greene, was that the result of the fact that Marion foremost considered himself a continental officer rather than a militia officer?
Yeah, I think you hit it there. He was very proud of that Continental Commission. Yes. He wanted to act this habit of his militia suddenly disappearing, one time he was left with, 70 men, perhaps less. It drove him right up the wall when they would just go off. And often they had good reason to go off. They were worried about their families and their property. But yes, he was very proud of that Continental Commission. Yes, sir.
What main importance would you put on the Valley, Utah Springs, heading up to Cornwallis and surrendering Yorktown.
Well, it ended the ability of the last British field army in the South to take the field. And Stuart had to retreat within the lines of Charleston. And of course, it was the last battle in the South, the last major battle in the South, and except for Yorktown, of course, but in the lower South. So it really spelled the death knell of the British efforts in South Carolina and Georgia. And it was only a matter of time then before Charleston and Savannah fell. Although something very interesting, even as you get down towards the end of the war, Lord Germain is still talking, the minister in London, Secretary of State for America, is still talking about hanging on to New York, Charleston, and Savannah as posts where they could bring troops back from the West Indies during this fever season down there and rest them in America on the mainland before sending them back to the West Indies. Because, of course, they were fighting the French down there to become a world war for the Brits. Yes, sir.
What kind of obligation did a commissioned officer for the Continentals have? In hearing the various speakers the last several days, it seems like people were moving freely from militia, from the Continental side to the militia side.
I don't think there was that much movement, really. No. I mean, even though Marion had a Continental Commission, he never became really a Continental officer during the fighting. I don't think there was that much movement. I mean, I could stand corrected on that. But yes, ma'am.
I think the references you're seeing is with the fall of Charleston, there were a lot of former Continentals whose either regiments had been destroyed and they were just kind of floating, or people who had expired enlistments who had been Continentals, they came out to serve in the militia. And so you get this reference that the militia contains Continental soldiers. Well, they're people who have expired enlistments, basically. And then, just like the Army did right up through the Vietnam War, if you were in the militia service and you followed up, they sent you over to the Continental line to serve a year or for the war or whatever. So you had that cross too, but there was no, I'm a Continental today, I'll be a militia tomorrow.
Thank you.
And that's
Ray?
Could you discuss the cooperation between Pickens and Daniel Morgan on the influence of the battle strategy?
Especially the Battle of Cowpens.
Well,
You can't fault that cooperation. And Morgan had a high regard for Pickens, as did Greene. Yeah. Splendid cooperation.
Until March.
Until March.
Until March, when Pickens said, "To heck with this, I'm going home."
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. But up until then, Pickens was a paragon.